Cathaoirleach, it's now 22 months since this House enacted legislation that imposed very significant restrictions on people's lives and freedoms. At the time, Minister Donnelly and myself, and indeed Deputy Lahart, were in opposition. We were at the other side of the chamber. But in fairness to this Dáil, every party in this chamber agreed with that legislation that was enacted back in March 2020. And I think also that all independent deputies supported it as well. It is important, however, that we reflect on the powers that were given as a result of that legislation, because they were extraordinary powers. We were given the power to restrict people's freedom of movement. We were given power to stop people from leaving their house unless they had a reasonable excuse. There were powers given to close down schools and for children to be educated at home, and there were even powers to close down businesses and restrict people from playing sport. So they were extraordinary powers that this House delegated to the Minister for Health. The reason we did so was because of the great fear that we had. Fear of a pandemic about which we knew so little and which seemed to be posing such a threat around the world, where it initially started in China, but in particular when it came into Italy, it sent shockwaves throughout the rest of Europe. After that, Cathaoirleach, we had significant lockdowns in this country. In fact, when you look at it relative to the rest of the world, we probably imposed some of the most strict and lengthy lockdowns in the world. The reason the Irish public went along with that, and the reason why the body politic remained united in respect of that, was, I suppose, being blunt, because of fear and because of hope. The fear was the fear of this unknown disease and what it was going to do to the public, and the fact that so many people were dying as a result of it throughout the world. But the hope was also hugely important as well. And the hope was that vaccines were coming on the horizon. It was one of the most remarkable achievements of mankind so far in this century, to produce vaccines that have been so effective in protecting people in respect of this dangerous disease. And in fairness to you, Minister, and you don't generally get credit from the media or from the opposition, but what they can't take away from you is the fact that you presided over an extremely successful vaccination programme, and I believe you're continuing to do so. What we managed to achieve in this country was quite extraordinary. We got 93%, or we have 93% of the adult population vaccinated. I think if we'd said that to people in this House before the vaccination programme started, they would have thought it highly unlikely that that level of success could be achieved. What we also now see, however, is the extent to which the vaccines are effective. I think you've mentioned, Minister, that when you look at people in ICU, 50% of the people who are in ICU are unvaccinated, and they don't have underlying conditions, whereas the 50% who are vaccinated regrettably do have underlying conditions. And obviously we wish all people in hospital well and to ensure that they can get out of ICU. I suppose the purpose of the lockdowns, the purpose of the restrictions, was to ensure that our health system did not become overrun. That was the primary objective of it, and that was the reason why it was justified and accepted in here. When you look at it today, we have 528 people in hospital, 110 of them are in ICU. Our health system is not being overrun. I think we need to recognise as well, however, Minister, that there's obviously threats to the healthcare system, but also we need to recognise that the Irish public have been through an awful lot. And I think that today is a day when many people are concerned. They're concerned because, notwithstanding the fact that we have 93% of the population vaccinated, and we've had some of the lengthiest and strictest lockdowns in the world, that we are considering reimposing restrictions. And it's a very difficult task that you and the Cabinet have, Minister, but I think it is important that we take that factor into account, just in terms of where the public is in respect of this issue. You have a very difficult task, particularly when the National Public Health Emergency Team puts out information to the effect that it is making recommendations to you, puts the government in a very difficult position. But I do think it is very important when you're making that decision that we try to retain the level of agreement and consensus that existed in this House and that exists in the Irish public to date. Unfortunately, my concern, and it's probably inevitable as time goes on, that support is going to become more fractured and more fragmented. Back 22 or 20 months ago, I emphasised what I thought was the importance of looking at the consequences of the restrictions. We all see the consequences of the pandemic in the 5,700 COVID-associated deaths and the people in hospital. But I suppose what we don't appreciate is the extent, the damage the restrictions can have on different sections of our population. I've always been extremely concerned about the impact lockdowns had on children. The closure of schools, in my opinion, was devastating to children, and we need a much broader perception of what public health is when we consider issues in respect of schools. It is a great achievement that our schools have remained open, but there should be no question mark over our schools closing, Cathaoirleach. It is absolutely fundamental to the educational, social, physical, personal and public health development of children in general that schools stay open. One thing I have noticed, however, is that the levels of anxiety in Irish society have increased significantly in recent times. I believe there's a fear out there that we're in this endless cycle of new variants coming each year, and that inevitably that results in government and the Oireachtas being supporting further restrictions to restrict people's movements. We need to recognise, however, Cathaoirleach, that we're in a completely different position today in December 2021 than we were in March 2020 or indeed in December 2020. The benefits of the vaccination mean something, and they are significant. I think one of the great advantages of there being such a widespread vaccination is we can now have a broader assessment of what is risk. Like at the beginning of the pandemic, risk was looked at exclusively in terms of the impact the pandemic is having on our public health system and the impact the disease is having on individuals. We now need to recognise we need a broader assessment of risk, and when we're looking at restrictions, we've got to recognise the damage that they can do to the public at large as well, particularly children and young people. So, Minister, I will support the legislation. I think it's important that you have that power, but I know you will be very careful in exercising it, because I know and believe you'll take into account the factors that I've mentioned.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Deputy Callaghan. Deputy